Developing the knight early opens up flexible pawn structures and prepares for castling. Challenging white's central pawn ambitions immediately, establishing a solid foothold and preparing for active piece development. Challenging black's central pawn structure immediately. This move aims to seize the initiative and create dynamic imbalance. Pushing the pawn isolates it, creating a fascinating structural dynamic where its advanced position becomes both a strength and a potential weakness. Pawn thrust d4 is now a bit isolated, and this move shores up the center, preparing for queenside development. Developing the knight further solidifies black's central pawn chain and prepares for piece activity on the queenside. Capturing that pawn opens a diagonal for your bishop and simplifies the position, aiming for a comfortable middle game. Immediately reclaiming the pawn with the knight opens a direct central confrontation, challenging white's pawn structure and initiating active piece play. Opening the d-file now, preparing to challenge the knight's central influence. Reclaiming the pawn with the queen immediately unblocks the bishop and brings the heaviest piece into the center's immediate vicinity. Instantly challenging the queen establishes a clear developmental advantage. Reinforcing the d4 pawn now opens up the c8 bishop for future development. Opening the diagonal for the queen's bishop sets up a harmonious development plan. Opening up the center strategically grants your king more breathing room and prepares a powerful pawn advance. Liberating the queen bishop, this develops a piece with tempo, preparing to castle and contest the center. Retreating the queen here concedes central influence, allowing white to comfortably expand their pawn structure and coordinate pieces. Developing the bishop facilitates castling, creating a more secure royal refuge and improving piece coordination. Developing the knight to f6 provides essential defensive cover for the kingside and prepares to castle, solidifying black's position. Securing the king amidst this pawn tension, white prepares for central play. Developing the bishop to e7 prepares for kingside castling and helps coordinate the queenside minor piece. Safeguarding the monarch from potential diagonal threats on the h1 square now frees up the g1 square for future maneuvering. Completing the kingside fortification solidifies the monarch's safety, preparing to contest central space. Injecting immediate central dynamism, this pawn thrust aims to shatter black's solid pawn structure and seize initiative, potentially opening lines for attack. Initiating pawn exchanges frees the queen and opens lines, a bold tactical choice amid this positional skirmish. Activating the rook on the f-file dramatically increases pressure against black's uncastled king. Developing the bishop to e6 solidifies the center and prepares to contest the d-file while avoiding immediate confrontation. Opening that d-file now seems premature given black's centralized pawns and ready development. Reclaiming central influence is paramount, aiming to liberate the queen from its passive role. Solidifying the central pawn structure and preparing for a potential kingside attack, this bishop repositions effectively. Shifting the bishop to that diagonal aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially eye the kingside. Positioning the queen centrally, white aims to pressure the d6 pawn and potentially exploit the semi-open d-file. Initiating a potential queenside battery, black aims to disrupt white's bishop placement and open lines for the queen. Unleashing the bishop onto the long diagonal, white creates immediate pressure on black's central pawn structure and eyes the vulnerable king. Shifting the queen to c7 aims to bolster the c-pawn and prepare for potential queenside expansion, although it vacates the d-file for white's rook. Securing the king's perimeter and activating the rook for central file pressure seems a logical follow-up to the bishop's strategic repositioning. Shifting the bishop to g6 creates an awkward defensive structure, potentially leaving the king exposed along the g-file. Unleashing the rook so aggressively, a bold attempt to dominate the h-file, but it exposes the king to potential counterplay. Reclaiming the central e-file for maneuvering is a sound positional choice, preparing to challenge white's rook. Unlocking the kingside diagonal opens lines for your bishop to pressure the black queen, and potentially create mating threats. Reorganizing the queen to the back rank sacrifices valuable time and development for a passive position. Liberating the bishop from its defensive post unlocks attacking potential. Reopening the f-file after the exchange creates immediate attacking possibilities for your opponent against your uncastled king, demanding careful defensive maneuvering. The rook now eyes the critical central squares, aiming to exploit any weaknesses in black's pawn structure. Recentering the queen to d7 aims to re-establish queenside influence and prepare for pawn advancements, seeking active play. Consolidating the queenside pawn structure sets up a potential b4 advance, aiming to restrict black's knight and gain queenside space. Connecting the rooks offers a fluid reshuffle of black's forces, aiming to challenge white's central grip. Seeking to unblock the queen and potentially activate the rook on the d-file, this maneuver prepares for a future pawn push or repositioning. Re-establishing central pressure by threatening to dislodge the knight creates dynamic play. Unleashing pawn pressure, this thrust aims to dismantle black's pawn structure and seize central dominance. Breaking the pawn chain opens diagonals and activates the queen, but sacrifices king's safety. Opening the c-file now secures vital central influence and pressures black's queenside structure. A timely queen repositioning aims to disrupt white's control over the d5 pawn and potentially exploit the opened lines. Opening that central file seeks to disrupt black's pawn structure and pressure the isolated queen. Re-engaging the bishop to target the pawn center and prepare for further pawn advances in the middle game. A patient repositioning of the pawn to prevent further penetration on the kingside. Preparing for a pawn push on the kingside while bolstering piece coordination. Liberating the bishop from its cramped position opens vital diagonals for queenside influence. Recovering the queen immediately aims to simplify and avoid a worse positional bind. Reclaiming the central pawn structure, white aims to open lines for active piece play. Trading off your rook here opens the e-file and offers white a central pawn majority, a significant positional concession. Reclaiming the queen opens up white's rook on the semi-open d-file. Preparing to seize control of the queenside and activate the inactive rook. Reconnecting the rooks, this maneuver aims to consolidate white's queenside control and prepare for potential central pawn breakthroughs. A knight seeking active squares, this maneuver aims to occupy the advanced e3 outpost, creating tactical threats. Reasserting central control, this rook embarks on a vital repositioning, aiming to invigorate white's cramped position. Unleashing a knight check at this precise moment creates immediate threats around white's monarch, forcing a reactive defense. Securing the king against immediate threats is paramount, though it concedes some central influence. Sacrificing the rook this way opens up attacking lines towards the enemy king. Reclaiming the central files offers counterplay, but neglects the rampant knight threat on g3. Guardian of the royal family scurries to safety, seeking to escape the encroaching enemy pieces. Unlocking the knight's potential for a central breakthrough. A critical blunder, surrendering the initiative and exposing the king to immediate danger. Reclaiming the queen offers a chance to simplify and press a slight material advantage. The rook's excursion to the 5th rank looks ambitious, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and perhaps infiltrate. Opening the d-file with the rook finally creates active play and targets black's vulnerable queenside pawns. Reactivating the rook from its defensive post now allows it to influence the center and potentially contest key files. Liberating your queen to infiltrate the queenside offers a strategic pivot, creating dynamic counterplay. Transitioning to an endgame often dictates exchanging pieces, simplifying the board and revealing pawn structure weaknesses. Clearing the file opens avenues for your rook and pawn advances, vital in this simplified position. Opening the d-file for the rook offers dynamic counterplay, aiming to activate the king's defense. Repositioning the king offers a safer haven while eyeing central pawn advancements. Consolidating pieces for for the inevitable pawn endgame now begins. Centralizing the king opens avenues for activity and prepares to contest the d-file, aiming to improve piece coordination in the endgame. Bringing the king closer to the action is crucial for supporting the pawns and preparing for any potential threats on the open files. Initiating a king hunt by leveraging the open files for a decisive check and subsequent piece activity. Relocating the rook to the 6th rank aims to disrupt white's centralized king and potentially exploit the open file. Exchanging the rook simplifies the position, leading directly into a queen and pawn endgame where white holds a slight advantage. Accepting the doubled pawns fundamentally alters the structure, creating a permanent weakness on the king side for black. Reinforcing the kingside pawn chain aims to control crucial squares and limit black's maneuvering. Chasing the passed pawn now becomes a primary objective for black's monarch. Pushing the pawn forward solidifies your queenside pawn structure, setting up potential space gains. This pawn push opens the king's path, but aims to control the center and potentially activate the king itself in the endgame. Pushing the king forward ignites the endgame, seeking active play before pawns become too restrictive. Reinforcing the queenside pawn structure with this move aims to prevent white's pawns from advancing further down the board. Opening lines for attack, the pawn advances to contest control of the g-file and expose the opponent's king. Exposing your king to further pawn storms with this capture opens a path for white's rook. The pawn push now irrevocably solidifies white's central pawn structure, transforming a passive position into one with active potential. Unlocking new diagonals for your remaining rook and bishop, though the central pawn majority for white is a serious concern now. King's desperate lunge attempts to salvage something from this unraveling position. Exploiting the open queenside, this captures a pawn and creates attacking chances on the now weakened file. Simplifying the pawn structure opens the path to king activity, a crucial advantage in this endgame. Activating the monarch into the pawn battlefront is a brave choice, aiming to shepherd the remaining pawns to promotion. Your king is now in a commanding position, ready to march down the board and become a fearsome force in this pawn endgame. The black monarch scrambles for a sanctuary on the queen side, but the king hunt continues relentlessly across the open board. Capturing the pawn is a natural endgame progression, securing material and simplifying toward a winning advantage with the exposed black king. The black king ventures out, seeking activity in this simplified kingside battle, aiming to influence the remaining pawns. Securing the king's safety with this pawn advance is paramount as the opposing monarch becomes more active. The king makes its final push towards the center, seeking active participation in the endgame's pawn race. Repositioning the king to the center offers greater influence over the remaining pawns and potential discoveries. Seeking shelter for your monarch amongst these precarious pawns is a risky endeavor, given white's active rooks. King advances to a central square, threatening to infiltrate black's weakened pawn structure. King's march towards the center signals a bold endgame bid for activity. Propelling the king forward seizes crucial central space, a bold advance into the territory of the pawns. The king ventures into open territory, but the remaining pawns offer little defense against the approaching royalty. The king bravely ventures forward to support the pawn's advance, a decisive endgame maneuver. Unleashing the king further into the enemy camp, a bold decision aiming to create decisive infiltration. The monarch's final push to capture the last pawn. Fleeing the advancing king, black seeks refuge on a less exposed square, a desperate attempt to survive the onslaught. Capturing the pawn on b6 decisively seizes the queenside advantage and opens pathways for the king's decisive advance. Pawns become unstoppable steamrollers in this endgame. This pawn advance ignites a decisive sprint towards promotion. Securing the queenside pawn majority with this advance solidifies control over the critical central squares. The king's exposed position now invites aggressive pursuit by white's monarch. Seizing the pawn opens a clear path for the king to dominate the queenside, creating decisive activity. Shifting the king now opens lines for kingside activity and can prepare a pawn advance. The monarch advances, eyeing the unprotected queenside pawns as a swift route to victory.